So in 2010, two Canberra researchers, Colin Butler and David Harley, enumerated 3 ways that climate change was likely to affect health. The primary health effects are those where the climate or weather operates directly on the human organism to impede health. The example of the heat wave in Paris with the additional fatalities is a really good example of that. The secondary effects of climate change are ecologically mediated. One of the common examples given is changes to mosquito-borne diseases like dengue and malaria. And we expect for places that become warmer and perhaps moister, we'll see an expansion of some important diseases that will impair health pretty substantially. In a nutshell today, I'm going to put sort of 2 propositions to you. The first is that climate change will decrease resource security, and particularly food security, globally. And this, in turn, will increase the likelihood of migration and conflict. The second basic proposition to all this is that food security, migration, and conflict all have health implications, and we'll spend some time exploring that. But before we get too much further, I just want to explain causation, or what I mean by causation. When we talk about climate change causing conflict or increasing the risk of conflict, we don't mean that climate change by itself causes conflict. No one, I think, believes that simply increasing the planet's temperature is going to cause people to fight with each other. Instead, it's going to interact with already tense situations and make things, social situations and political situations, worse. So it's sort of like a risk multiplier. Think of it as loading the dice in favor of conflict a little bit compared to how the dice are loaded currently. First, let's turn our attention to food scarcity. Climate change it's virtually certain, is going to decrease food production in some areas. And without mitigation, climate change over the longer term could reduce food productivity globally. Particular regions are going to be hit harder than others, of course. And it is the equatorial belt that is likely to see its food production decline the most in the short and medium term. And they're hit with a sort of double whammy because many of the countries around that equatorial belt are also the least capable of adapting in terms of the financial capital that they have, in terms of the technology that's already available to them. Additionally, areas like some of the world's river deltas are going to be at particular risk as sea levels rise and salinization becomes a problem. And that's important because places like the Mekong Delta and the Nile River Delta are really important regionally for food production. Australia is a comparatively lucky country in this respect. Many projections do forecast food production declining within Australia because of climate change. However, we're fortunate enough to be able to buy our way out, in that even if Australia stops becoming a food exporting nation, we're mostly wealthy enough to buy it from other countries. But that mostly is a key word, because we know wealth and opportunity are not evenly distributed in Australia. And so in some groups, especially the poor, increases in local food prices or world food prices will translate into an increased risk of them not having access to adequate nutrition. One group that I want to focus on in particular are Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. And they have a particular relationship with country in Australia. This is important partly because for a number of Indigenous people, traditional food gathering practices are still an important part of the total makeup of their diet and a source of nutrition. However, climate change is disrupting the ecology on which they have traditionally relied and will continue to do so. And so will decrease the productivity of some of the important things that they have, some of their important food sources. Additionally, Indigenous traditional culture is very much guided by traditional Dreamtime stories. And these stories allow people to know when to harvest different animals or plants because of what happened in the Dreamtime. And those stories often talk about associations. So it's time to harvest this plant when this animal starts having its babies. Unfortunately, climate change is altering the timing of those events and making the traditional stories, which have been a really effective guide for thousands of years, less relevant. So that not only affects the ability to gather food, but also is disruptive to traditional culture and spirituality. Focusing on Indigenous people just a little bit longer, when we think about adaptation to climate change, we can conceptualize it as happening on several levels. First, all of us adapt to slight challenges to our health all the time. If there's a heat wave, we drink more water, and our body undergoes a number of responses to keep our core body temperature in the right range. Because Indigenous people on the whole have poorer baseline health, they're less able to make these physiological adaptations and are therefore at greater risk. The relative poverty that many Indigenous people experience compared to other Australians makes them less able to adapt at the household level. It's harder to buy an air conditioner if you just don't have the money. And finally, it's likely that larger systemic adaptations that happen throughout Australia will not favor Indigenous people, partly because of location. We know many rural areas in Australia are not as well serviced with infrastructure, and also Indigenous people have less access to the sort of levers of power in Australia. And when those large-scale adaptations are made, it's likely they will miss out. Let's expand, though, our frame of inquiry to... wonderful. Thank you so much. Let's expand our frame of inquiry to the globe again, though, and look specifically at migration. And when we think about migration and when we hear about it in the media, often we have a prior conception of poor people knocking on the door of wealthier countries. And certainly that will make up some small percentage of climate change associated migration. But in fact, most climate change migration will be within and between poor countries. People that are migrating because of climate change are often quite resource poor and simply don't have the resources to move themselves and their families to a developed country. And there are cultural reasons why they might not want to anyway. So virtually every scholar on this topic does predict that climate change will increase migration. And in theory, this is a really useful way to adapt to climate change. If we could think about where the areas that are going to see their resources decrease are, identify them, identify those populations most at risk within them, and move them to areas where resources will be stable or even increase because of climate change, then that would be a great solution. But unsurprisingly, that's not how the world is responding to climate change. Instead, international migration is being met with a lot of increased xenophobia in politics of a number of countries. So in Australia, we've had for some time a turn back the boats policy and a real desire to be very strict in who we let into the country. it is not a very hard argument to make that Brexit happened in no small part because British people were worried about primarily Syrian refugees coming in and not being stopped at the borders. And because international migration is a political act, it is subject to political volatility. And so we have to anticipate that as more and more climate migration happens, there is likely to be an increase in xenophobia of the sort that Donald Trump and Pauline Hanson give some comfort to. Within developing countries, and this will be where most of the climate migration is, responses are also likely to be not quite as helpful as we might hope. And that's because most of the migration within developing countries will be from rural areas that are experiencing drought or decreased agricultural productivity to the cities by people looking for work when they can't make their living on the land anymore. But these cities in developing countries rapidly become overstretched in terms of their infrastructure and can't offer the jobs that people are hoping for. And so the outcomes there are not particularly good for health at all. If we look at it more systematically, we can say and look at sort of whether climate migration is good for different groups. It mostly is going to be good for the migrants themselves. For the people that they leave behind, intuitively we might think those people will be better off because there are fewer people to consume the set level of resources. But that may not work out that way because it is often the people that migrate who have the most social capital and the most financial capital. And so when those people leave, the types of adaptations that would allow that area to increase its productivity or at least adapt to climate change more effectively are no longer available. Now, if people send home remittances, maybe we get a balancing back, but on the whole, I think the donor populations may not benefit from this sort of migration. Recipient countries or areas may also not benefit. I'm not talking about Australia taking another 10,000 Syrian refugees. I'm talking about refugee camps on the Turkish border taking another 100,000 Syrian refugees. The other thing that we've touched on already is that climate migration now, because it is leading to increased xenophobia, is likely to preclude future migration. As countries react with horror to people coming, they'll tighten their border controls, as we've seen in much of the Western world. And so for the next Syria, it will be harder for people to leave. Talking about Syria, we can see that conflict and migration are very much mutually reinforcing things. People have left Syria as they have because of the conflict there. And at the same time, large levels of migration can also increase the risk of conflict for various reasons. Not least, you get potentially overstretched resources. Often large-scale migration brings into contact ethnic groups that don't historically get along. And in the context of resource scarcity, that can flare up into conflict. And you have climate change feeding both of these things and reinforcing an already self-perpetuating cycle. Now, I've alluded to climate change increasing the risk of conflict. And in principle, this is proven somewhat contentious within the discipline of political science, although, interestingly, there's almost no debate at all within archaeology, the health field, or within the military itself. Those areas There's pretty close to consensus on the issue. But I think it's contentious because this is a really methodologically complex question to answer. And you can't use double-blind control studies for this. There is no alternative Earth that we can, see what happens when there's no climate change. And so people vary on how much they extrapolate from the data, which data they use to extrapolate from, whether they look at recent history or more ancient history. And recent history is, and it has the advantage of using a social system pretty similar to the one that we are experiencing now and that we expect in 20 years from now. However, the scale of climate change that we are anticipating over the next 100 years or 500 years doesn't have probably any analog in the history of human civilization. And the last 50 years don't have the best analogs at all. Some of the best analogs are, for instance, the Little Ice Age. So there is not a perfect time period to look at in this. There's also differences, or there are differences in how qualitative or quantitative researchers are. Let's start by looking at some of the pathways that qualitative researchers have suggested will lead to climate change. So first, we know climate change is going to affect the natural environment in ways that decrease resource availability for humans as we currently exploit resources. This in turn will have a number of social consequences like migration and resource scarcity, which involves not just the level of resources that are produced or available, but how they're distributed, and individual people losing their livelihoods. In turn, these things reinforce each other and lead to additional social phenomena like increased population pressure in some areas, depopulation of other areas, and those things are important because they lead to a misalignment between infrastructure, especially infrastructure with a long lead time and a long active life, and populations that need them. Can lead to increased ethnic tensions, decreased economic productivity, and political instability. And all of these things are self-reinforcing, but also lead to a weakened state. And the weakened state is really a linchpin causal step in civil conflict. One of the key things that occurs when a state has reduced power is that the state can begin to lose its monopoly on violence. One of the key aspects of the social contract between a government and its people is that the government's meant to keep you safe. And people will put up with a whole lot if the government keeps them safe. Most people, in fact, would rather live on their knees than die on their feet. We're mostly not revolutionaries. But there are some among us who are. And these challengers may sense government weakness. You're not going to have a big revolt against a really strong government if you know it's going to fail. But if you think you might succeed, then maybe you do revolt. And that, in turn, weakens the government further. And it also creates a situation where if an area is controlled by a non-government force, or even partly controlled by it, and we can think even of, parts of LA where police don't want to go because it's too dangerous. In those parts of LA, you don't rely on the police for your protection if you're local. You rely on the local gang. They're not angels, but they're the ones that are in fact enforcing violence or lack of violence. So the reduced monopoly on violence by the state is a really self-perpetuating thing, and it really can rapidly erode the social contract between the people and the government. Sometimes to distract from this or other aspects of state weakness, state elites will foment violence against either a minority group or a neighbor. And the idea here is that in this sort of conflict, they will retain power. They say, we're the only one that can protect you from the Jews or the Hutus or whoever it is. And they use that to solidify their power, even though the state is not delivering on a whole lot of the goods or services that it ought to be. So that's the way that you can link climate change to civil conflict. But there are also commentators that note that some interstate conflicts may be made more likely by climate change. These include, for instance, a conflict between India and Pakistan. Climate change may melt the glaciers on which they both rely, and it will disrupt the monsoons on which they both rely for their agriculture. They currently have water-sharing treaties, but these didn't envision climate change and don't have mechanisms, as far as I'm aware, for renegotiation. And since these countries already have a few tensions with each other, you can imagine this escalating, particularly because the livelihood of so many of their citizens depends on it. And it really only takes one little nuclear exchange to undo decades of health progress. So we've talked about how theoretically climate change might lead to conflict. Let's look at the archaeological record. Archaeologists studying a number of civilizations at different times in different places have observed that climate change that reduced food availability led to conflict. I won't go through them all. Zhang and colleagues did a more quantitative study and looked over about a millennium at all of the conflicts that were recorded and a bunch of other social phenomena. And they, based on their data, thought that climatic change, which was natural, was in fact the main driver of war and peace cycles, like global war and peace cycles. Let's see. Xiang and colleagues looked more recently. Between 1950 and I think 2004, they looked at all of the countries that experience El Nino, La Nina. And they said, El Nino is, in many respects, a good proxy measure for climate change. Things are hotter, things are drier, which for a lot of countries will be what climate change brings. And they found that in El Nino years, the risk of civil conflict starting was twice as high as La Nina years. So the qualitative evidence is pretty strong, or the quantitative evidence. Now, on one hand, it's really intuitive that if there's more conflict, that's going to be bad for health. People are going to shoot each other. In many conflicts, rape will be used as a weapon, and food meant for civilians will be deliberately targeted. But there are also indirect consequences of conflicts on health, like the killing of doctors and interruption to immunization programs. It's hard to imagine that we're going to eradicate polio as long as conflict persists in Afghanistan, which is one of the few holdout countries. More broadly, if climate change on the whole increases the risk of conflict throughout the globe, we can expect individual governments to react to that by saying, our neighborhood isn't very safe, and I'm going to shift a little bit of this health spending and this determinant of health spending, like education, to defense, because I'm worried about the civil conflict that's just over the border. Right now, we enjoy as a globe the level of good health and record longevity that we do because of our health systems. And I think what I've hoped to show is that climate change is going to put increased pressure on health systems through a variety of mechanisms. At the same time, though, it's going to decrease health system capacity, in part because of conflict and migration, which, as I suggested earlier, will misalign population needs and infrastructure. Increased hunger is going to limit the individual development of future doctors and hospital administrators and impair economic growth. So really, we're burning the health system at both ends with increased pressure and decreased resources compared to a world without climate change. And we know ecological degradation and climate change is bad, but we're not quite doing a whole lot about that. And there are, I think, some reasons why. And it's important, though, that we focus on what we can do about that and action that we can take in Australia. And so I'm excited to hand over, because I know we're going to hear a lot more about that. Thank you.